It all began with a thrilling mountain biking session back in the early days of March 2010. Where I reside in the UK, the mountain biking season typically commences once the frost thaws out. The firmer, colder ground usually promises better traction, but it also brings along a slew of challenges. One of the risks being some pretty ghastly injuries if luck isn't on your side during a fall. Getting injured in the spring could mean missing out on the exciting summer adventures, so it's wise to exercise caution and wait for the weather to ease up a bit before tackling the more intense trails. Fast forward to March 2010. It had been one of the chilliest winters in recent memory, and neither myself nor my closest buddy, who also happened to be my flatmate, had ventured out biking for months. By the time spring rolled around, we were itching so badly to hit the trails again that we were practically sweating bullets. As soon as the temperatures climbed back into the double digits, we wasted no time planning our first proper ride of the year. Before we knew it, we were loading up our gear and packing some lunch into the trunk of his car, heading about 15 miles out of town to this expansive forest renowned for having the best mountain biking trails in the Northeast. Everything was going smoothly for the first few hours, and the rush of being back on our bikes was exhilarating. But then, something occurred that altered my friend's life forever, to the extent that remembering who he was before seems like a distant memory now. I'd rather not disclose his real name, so let's just refer to him as Andy. Andy was hurtling down this steep slope when his front wheel encountered an obstacle it couldn't handle. I've never witnessed anyone wipe out like that before. It was as if his bike had been flung into the air, landing him almost squarely on his head. I felt the impact as if it were my own, seeing his helmet so severely damaged that the plastic was cracked all over the top. For what seemed like an eternity, he was knocked out cold. It was one of the most harrowing and traumatic days of my life, desperately trying to guide an ambulance crew to our location when I barely had a clue where we were. I feared losing my best friend because fear and panic clouded my ability to think clearly. Thankfully, the emergency responders are trained for precisely these situations. Within about 45 minutes of dialing 999, Andy was strapped onto a stretcher and whisked away in an awaiting ambulance. But let me tell you, those 45 minutes felt like an eternity at the time. In the immediate aftermath, people hailed Andy's recovery as miraculous. However, looking back, the word miracle feels inappropriate, given the horrors that followed. In short, Andy should have sustained a broken neck, or at the very least, suffered enough head trauma to leave him in a vegetative state. Somehow, whether by sheer luck or the quality of his helmet, he evaded the worst possible outcomes. Nonetheless, the doctors cautioned us to keep a close eye on his behavior in the ensuing months and to report anything out of the ordinary. The initial sign that something was amiss came when Andy, amidst our amazement at the helmet's durability and his own resilience or luck, attributed his survival to a higher power. This was quite the departure for Andy, who had never shown a hint of religious inclination before. Suddenly, he embraced religion with fervor, transitioning from his family's Church of England background to hardcore Catholicism. He abandoned late Saturday nights with me in favor of attending morning mass, eschewed meat on Fridays, and even reprimanded me for casual expressions like Jesus Christ. While initially, Andy's newfound faith seemed tolerable, albeit a bit irritating, it quickly veered into the realm of the bizarre. He began compensating for missed Lenten observances by fasting from food and water during daylight hours, rejecting suggestions of a milder sacrifice like giving up chocolate. His determination to prove his fasting abilities intensified, resulting in a noticeable physical transformation by the end of the first week, leaner, more alert, and oddly enthusiastic about mealtimes. However, as he pushed himself further into the second week, his condition deteriorated rapidly. He became fixated on extending his fasting duration, neglecting both his physical and mental well-being. Regrettably, I, like everyone else, initially overlooked Andy's alarming behavior, assuming it was his coping mechanism for the accident. It wasn't until the third week when he withdrew almost entirely into his room, his physical appearance indicating severe malnutrition, that I grew truly concerned. When I confronted him, he acknowledged his extreme behavior but dismissed it, eagerly anticipating Easter when he believed everything would magically return to normal. His reassurance provided a brief relief, but deep down I knew something was gravely wrong. I longed for the return of my friend, the Andy I knew before the accident, someone who joined me for a Nando's feast on Sundays or eagerly hit the trails again if the weather permitted. Yet, as Easter approached, my anticipation was tinged with apprehension, uncertain if Andy would ever truly return to himself. So let's fast forward to Sunday, April 4th, 2010. After a night of indulging in Jagger with some work pals, I woke up feeling like death warmed over around lunchtime. The only thing motivating me to crawl out of bed was the prospect of indulging in a massive hangover feast with Andy, who had assured me he'd be back to eating properly by then. After mustering the energy for a cup of tea, I noticed an unusual silence in the flat. Calling out Andy's name yielded no response. Assuming he had rushed out to break his fast with a mountain of burgers, I shrugged it off and headed back towards my room, coffee in hand. But as I passed Andy's room, I heard an odd thumping noise followed by what sounded like a growl emanating from inside. My curiosity piqued. I called out his name again, this time certain someone was in there. Knocking on the door repeatedly, I received no answer. A gut feeling urged me to investigate further. Perhaps he was just occupied with something embarrassing, I thought, but at least he'd be okay. However, what I discovered behind that door shattered any sense of normalcy. The room was dimly lit by candles, Andy's attempt at minimalist ambience. But it wasn't until then that I realized the extent of his devotion. Scripture adorned the walls, giving the room an unsettling, almost unhinged atmosphere. Yet, it was Andy's disturbing ritual with a metal bolt that sent me sprinting for the phone to dial his second ambulance in a month. He had fashioned the bolt into a makeshift spike and was gruesomely puncturing his palm, seemingly attempting to replicate the wounds of stigmata. The sight nearly turned my stomach, and the sound of blood dripping off his desk as I fled from the room still echoes in my mind. It took me a moment to grasp the gravity of what he was doing. Self-inflicted stigmata, a chilling testament to his descent into madness. Following Andy's attempt to replicate the wounds of Jesus during his crucifixion, the situation quickly spiraled into chaos. The self-harm aspect of the emergency call added a layer of complexity to the response. Initially, it was the police who arrived, intending to assess Andy's condition before hospitalization. What began as a simple conversation escalated into the police forcefully escorting Andy to the ambulance, deeming him a risk to himself and others. Witnessing this ordeal was incredibly distressing. While I firmly believe Andy never intended harm towards me or anyone else, the severity of his actions warranted intervention. The subsequent psychiatric evaluation and placement in a group home were necessary steps for his well-being. Unfortunately, Andy has never forgiven me for involving emergency services that day, leading to a strained relationship between us. However, I occasionally receive updates from his family, and it seems Andy is making progress. Though heavily medicated, he no longer fixates on dangerous ideas with the same intensity as before. The manic impulsiveness that once consumed him has also diminished. It's astonishing to witness the profound impact a head injury can have on one's psyche. Andy, as I once knew him, seems like a distant memory now. The person behind his familiar face is fundamentally altered, a reminder of the fragility of the human mind.
Hey there, folks. Today, I've got a story that'll send chills down your spine and leave you questioning reality. Picture this. A few years back, I found myself wandering the vibrant streets of the Philippines during Easter. Now, let me tell you, Easter isn't just another holiday in this deeply Christian country. It's a full-blown extravaganza. From extravagant feasts to bustling markets, the Filipino community takes Easter very, very seriously. Now, amidst all the festivities and mouth-watering cuisine, trust me, those pork skewers and dapa shrimp were to die for. I stumbled upon something that shook me to my core. Imagine strolling down a quaint alleyway, surrounded by revelers and partygoers, when suddenly, I lock eyes with Jesus. Well, not the real deal, of course, but a Filipino fellow decked out in a striking Jesus cosplay, complete with a crimson robe and thorny crown, lugging a massive cross. But here's where it gets even wilder. He wasn't alone. Oh no. He was joined by a motley crew of Roman soldiers, fully committed to their roles, barking orders and brandishing whips at anyone who dared to stray too close. It was like a scene straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster, except, real life. Now, as I stood there, slack-jawed and wide-eyed, trying to process this surreal spectacle, a friendly Pinoy gentleman, that's Filipino for ya, must have noticed my bewilderment. With a knowing smile, he beckoned me over and asked if I wanted to witness something truly mind-blowing. Needless to say, I couldn't resist. Little did I know, things were about to take an even crazier turn. As I followed the directions given to me and turned down the street, my eyes widened in disbelief. What greeted me was a scene straight out of a nightmare. Blood, everywhere. A group of about 15 to 20 men marched in a haunting loop, each wielding a whip adorned with dried palm fronds. The sound of the lashes cutting through the air sent shivers down my spine. But it wasn't the whips that were causing the blood to flow so freely. No, it was something far more sinister. Every so often, a man would break rank and approach another figure, seemingly holding something small in his hand. As they turned their backs, I watched in horror as he jabbed them with what I soon realized was a razor blade. The screams echoed through the street as they rejoined the line, their backs now covered in dozens of bleeding wounds. It was a ritual of self-flagellation, a punishment for their sins, or so I was told in broken English by a bystander. Growing up in an Irish neighborhood, I was no stranger to Catholic traditions, but this was on a whole other level. Confession and Hail Marys seemed tame in comparison. Feeling nauseous and overwhelmed, I retreated, desperate to find solace in the familiar sight of the Jesus cosplayer. Surprisingly, the locals greeted me warmly, their friendly, "Hey Joe," a welcome distraction from the gruesome spectacle unfolding before me. As I documented the events on my phone, I couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. Stay tuned for the next installment of this surreal journey through the streets of the Philippines. I can still vividly recall the moment we left the bustling streets behind and ascended a nearby hill. As we climbed, I couldn't shake the feeling of awe at the authenticity of the scene unfolding before me. They were truly reenacting the crucifixion, carrying Jesus out of town to be nailed to a cross atop the hill. At first, I assumed it was all just a theatrical performance, especially when I noticed two other men waiting with crosses of their own. But as we reached the summit and watched Jesus being laid upon his cross, the atmosphere shifted. A Roman soldier retrieved large nails from his pouch, and I felt a sinking sensation in my stomach. Despite silently pleading for them to stop, the inevitable occurred. The nail was aligned with Jesus' palm, and with each blow of the hammer, a wave of horror washed over me as blood erupted from his hand. Unable to bear witness any longer, I turned away and retreated from the scene. Meanwhile, the spectators were enraptured, some squirming in discomfort, others smiling as if witnessing a miraculous event. For the rest of the day, I was left numb, grappling with the enormity of what I had witnessed. While I struggled to comprehend the extreme devotion displayed, I couldn't help but respect the dedication of those involved, despite my personal reservations. Later, I sought clarification from a Filipino acquaintance at my hotel. According to him, the man being crucified does so annually, his palm already scarred from years of repetition. While I found it difficult to believe that such an act could become routine, it spoke volumes about the unwavering commitment to their faith. Love it or loathe it, there's no denying the sheer intensity of the experience.